Hello and welcome to our Sierra Forum. My name is Chris Hill and I am the acting director of the Our Wild America campaign here at Sierra Club. I will be your host for today's discussion, which gives Sierra Club members and supporters a chance to hear directly from our staff and partners about our work to protect clean air, clean water, a stable climate, wildlands, and ensure all people have equitable access to the outdoors. I'm currently based in Haines, Alaska, which is home to the Tlingit people on the beautiful Chilkat River. I use she, her pronouns. We have a great lineup for you today, and I'm super excited to jump right on in. We will do about 20 to 30 minutes of discussion and then leave plenty of time for question and answer. So please be sure to submit your questions in the Q&A box. So let's get started on a new era for lands conservation. We depend on nature for everything, just about. For the water we drink, the air we breathe, the food we eat. Nature keeps us physically and mentally healthy, powers our economy, grounds us during times of crisis, and connects us as a nation. Nature, however, is in steep decline. We are already seeing the devastating results of this. A football field's worth of natural lands disappears to development in the United States every 30 seconds. We are seeing more and more violent storms and natural disasters due to climate change that are devastating the lands and leaving communities at risk. Simultaneously, we are also seeing massive declines in wildlife populations. In the last 40 years, wildlife population has declined by 60% due to habitat loss, climate change, and other environmental factors. And while we are losing nature all across the country, fewer than half of all people in the United States live within walking distance of a park, really highlighting the great disparities in access to parks and outdoor spaces, especially for low-income neighborhoods and communities of color. But there is hope, and we must act now and we must be bold. Experts say that in order to stop the dual extinction and climate crisis and preserve clean water, clean air, and a stable climate, we need to protect 50% of the planet by 2050. To meet that goal in the United States, that means we need to protect 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. With only 12% of our country's lands currently protected, reaching this goal means more neighborhood green space, more urban parks, more wilderness, substantial increases in protections for rivers, lakes, and wetlands, and everything in between. With a new administration in Congress, we have a huge and exciting opportunity to act. The administration has an opportunity to reshape conservation in the United States with 30 by 30 into one that listens and centers communities most impacted by climate change, creates more green spaces and parks and monuments, and protects our waters. Today, we're going to hear a bit about this huge opportunity before us and how we can achieve protecting 30% of our lands and waters by 2030. Here today, we have with us Chairman Raul Grijalva, Shauna Edberg, and Dan Ritzman. Thanks so much for everything you all do and for taking some time to be with us today. I want to start with Mr. Grijalva. For folks who don't know, Chairman Grijalva is a true champion in Congress. As chair of the Natural Resources Committee, Mr. Grijalva is a leader in the fight against the climate crisis, who has focused on diversifying the environmental movement, holding a number of Capitol Hill roundtables with Native American tribes, women's groups, Asian American Pacific Islander and Latino organizations, and other communities traditionally underrepresented in environmental decision-making. He worked with communities across the country to write the Environmental Justice for All Act and continues to lead an effort supported by multiple tribes to withdraw lands around the Grand Canyon from uranium mining. Mr. Grijalva, thanks for joining us. As you know, we have a unique opportunity to seize the political momentum to combat the climate crisis. Just a few weeks ago, you and many of your other colleagues in Congress sent a letter to President Biden in support of his climate EO. executive order. Can you talk a little bit about this unique opportunity we have in front of us and what that looks like moving forward in Congress?
I, yeah, I think the opportunity is, you're absolutely correct. It is indeed an opportunity. And the backdrop to this opportunity has been uh, the struggle uh, of this country and this world around the pandemic and the effects of COVID on all of us, our quality of life, and importantly, I think what also affords us an opportunity, that's the backdrop, is that as we're dealing with COVID, we've opened up a portal that points to the issues that you also mentioned as well, and that has having to do with disparity, frontline communities, and also I think it's also opened up the discussion about the the interplay and codependency of our public health and well-being uh, with our environment in general, and as a going forward, I think that the issue of conservation and protection uh, and dealing with climate change is not only a survival issue for all species uh, on, on on the macro level, but also I think as we look at this pandemic and what it purports in terms of how we recover and how we plan for the future and how we integrate sustainability into that discussion, that I think that affords us an opportunity to talk about initiatives around not only 3030, but around almost everything we do with an eye toward the transition that this country of ours and the planet, for that matter, needs to go through quickly rather than taking a great deal of time. There's still the lingering deniers about climate change, that it doesn't exist, that it is just made up, that is the Earth, our planet basically shuddering and will be okay later. Well, I tend to side on the side of science, fact, and empirical evidence that that's not the case. That climate change is having an effect, continues to have an effect, and is more urgent and severe than we were predicting about and talking about 4 years ago. So that the land initiatives in terms of legislation, the protection of our waters, in terms of legislation, those are forthcoming. And we feel that they're important templates moving forward, both for the administration and for organizations like Sierra Club, Hispanic Access, et cetera, to be able to rally the American people around. And the American people want something done. They feel the protections and attached to the very important issue of conservation are vital and necessary, both for public health and going forward for sustainability long term and for all of us. And so I would say that EJ for All Act is important in terms of the equity issue and equal treatment issue, and that has to be part of the discussion going forward, and along with major pieces of legislation. I think what the administration has in front of it, both at EPA and at Interior and at Energy in terms of departments, is first of all to repair the damage that's been done and do that quickly ongoing, but also to start to change the administrative procedural approach to how we deal with the issues that we care about. Because there are many things within those departments administratively, in terms of personnel, raising science back to the status it should have in decision making that it doesn't have now. And quite frankly, ridding ourselves of the double dealing and deal making that occurred for the last 4.5 years under the previous administration, in which we basically said there is only one mission for our public lands and water, and that is what can we get out of them as resource, not what can we protect, not what can we plan for the long haul and how they contribute to the abatement and the mitigation of climate change. No, it was what can we get out of it. No more, and examples abound. And so, well, dealing with that corruption, dealing with that double dealing, I think is the task ahead in those agencies. But as we're doing that, we have to be able to chew gum and walk as well. And those are the legislative initiatives that have to happen. And I think one of the things that we're going to need going forward, the disagreements I think are minimal compared to the initiatives and the impetus that we have to have going forward. I mention this because I think it's getting it on the agenda and having elected officials deal with this on the floor of the House, in the Senate, in significant parts of the infrastructure bill, reconciliation, and continue to pass standalone pieces of legislation that empower what the administration has to do and provides guardrails and guideposts about how to get there. So I think that is an opportunity we need to take complete advantage of. And I think part of what we need as members of Congress is also to continue to promote the urgency of having action taken on many of these pieces of legislation. Sometimes the political risk is all assessed to issues dealing with the environment and climate change, and political risk is not assessed in other places. I think that the political risk around dealing with these issues is not severe. I think the American people support us doing something, and they're solution based as well. And so I think going forward, it is the effort that we make and the lobbying that we do and the urgency that we communicate to leadership that these are items that must be acted upon and votes must be taken. I think once we start taking the significant votes on EJ for all, the lands issue, the pieces of legislation, and the work that's being done on oceans and waters, those pieces of legislation, plus others that can be incorporated into these packages, the better off we're going to be in terms of setting the tone. But our urgency in the committee level is to move these as quickly as possible. And one of the things we're going to do is have an integrative effect too, bringing in indigenous community so that they are part of the conservation discussion and not just part of the extraction discussion. And bringing in communities by extending the green space access to our public lands and access to their public lands in terms of more urban attention to how we grow this constituency. So that's it for me. And I think I think we do have an opportunity, a great deal of urgency, and we feel that addressing these issues are part of the overall recovery, rebuilding better, and I think supported by the American public. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, and thank you for lifting up those pieces around equity. You know, as we think about reshaping what the conservation movement looks like, that's going to be key and center. And this really dovetails into the work of our next guest is holding, Shauna Edberg. As Hispanic Access Foundation's Director of Conservation Programs, Shauna works to promote environmental stewardship in Latino communities, elevate Latino voices in conservation policy, activate Latino conservation leaders, and provide them with the resources they need to create a sustainable and just future. Shauna, welcome.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about the environmental justice case for 30 by 30 and really incorporate the learnings from the Nature Gap report and why and how we can create an equity-centered 30 by 30 framework?
Yes, absolutely. I want to start by mentioning that today is Cesar Chavez Day. So on this day that we are honoring this incredible labor rights and civil rights activist, it's especially important to remember that the fight to protect nature and the fight to keep our most vulnerable communities healthy, safe, and powerful is one and the same struggle. Environmental justice is social justice. And what are we even doing in conservation if it isn't serving people as well as nature? So to dive a little bit more into that, the communities that have been suffering first, last, and worst from COVID-19 and from the natural disasters that we faced last year are the same communities that would benefit the most from 30 by 30 and having plenty of nature and parks nearby. So as we heard earlier, a football field's worth of nature is being lost and paved over every 30 seconds. This frightening pace of destruction is mostly due to infrastructure development and oil and gas development, which we know from other research actually worsens COVID-19. Communities that live in oil and gas areas are more likely to suffer from respiratory problems like asthma because of huge amounts of air and water pollution. And that also applies to where oil and gas are burned. So this would apply to you if you live near a highway, for example, or even if you spend a lot of time driving. And if something like asthma doesn't sound like a huge deal to you, you should know that Hispanic children are twice as likely as white children to die from asthma. So these environmental justice communities that are facing oil and gas pollution are suffering also from a lack of nature and increased severity of COVID-19 and any other respiratory problem that you can think of. So going more into the nature gap, we had research together with the Center of American Progress that found that communities of color across the US are 3 times as likely as white communities to live somewhere that is nature deprived. So that 30 seconds worth of that football field worth of nature destruction, this is where it's happening. And this disparity in where nature destruction takes place also applies to low-income communities. So that's also where nature destruction is disproportionately happening. And shockingly, we also found that it happens in areas that have a high concentration of families with children. So these communities of color, low-income communities, and communities that have a lot of young children are missing out on nature's benefits. And I'm sure you all know this, but just to reiterate, the benefits of nature include climate resilience, resilience to extreme heat days, flood protection, economic benefits from outdoor recreation businesses, boosts to local business from nearby parks and walking and biking, mental health benefits, stress relief, treatment for depression and anxiety, and everybody's safety valve from cabin fever right now. Physical health, of course, outdoor recreation and gyms not being super safe at the moment, and pollution reduction, because greenery absorbs pollution, and it even has an impact on children's performance in schools. So equitable access to nature at even a small scale as having trees on your street, and as big as a scale as our national parks and public lands, is absolutely crucial for the equity and well-being of communities of color and environmental justice communities. Because nature has all those benefits that I mentioned and more, our communities are lacking them, meaning that they're more vulnerable to climate change, have fewer economic opportunities, worse public health outcomes, and lower school performance. So 30 by 30 and protecting nature can be a tool for creating more equitable access to nature that these environmental justice communities need, but only if we do it right. So if we think about 30 by 30 as a tool rather than a goal in itself, that makes how we go about doing it just as important as actually reaching that goal, which we all know, super important. So what does doing it right mean? I think some important principles to keep in mind for it are that water and nature access should be there for everyone, urban and rural communities alike, and especially for communities that have historically lacked that access or are facing the nature gap and that high rate of nature destruction. Community consultation and engagement. Local communities' needs are met in terms of language programming, accessibility, for the disabled and other communities, and meeting any other needs. Ongoing resources to parks and natural areas that serve communities of color, and especially ensuring that maintenance is ongoing and provided for, because when things aren't maintained, they can quickly become unsafe. And then that's another avenue that inaccessibility can happen. Indigenous and tribal nations should have their ancestral lands protected and honored in the manner of their choosing, using tribal co-management arrangements, because we know from areas where Indigenous co-management is implemented around the world, we have better biodiversity outcomes, better social outcomes, better economic outcomes. Communities of color should have their histories, heritage, and stories told in their own words. Our conservation workforce, which remains overwhelmingly white, should be racially diverse and reflect the local communities that it serves. And we need to make connections across sectors, not just conservation. Things like transit, housing, all sorts of different sectors really affect the nature gap and environmental justice outcomes. So the long story short is that if we make progress on climate change and nature protection by implementing a just transition to renewable energy and conserving and restoring areas of nature near communities of color and communities facing the nature gap, then we can alleviate the current health crisis now, prevent future health crises, and providing tons of other benefits and promoting the equity that is so badly needed in our country.
Yes, thank you, Shauna. I appreciate all those words. And last but not least is certainly Sierra Club's own Dan Ritzman. Dan is the director of the Lands, Water, Wildlife campaign here at Sierra Club. He has been leading grassroots advocacy campaigns for nearly 3 decades, including defending the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and efforts for new protected areas all across the West. Dan has been at Sierra Club for 14 years, and in his role, he works with teams all across the country to empower grassroots leaders working to protect treasured landscapes. Hey, Dan.
Hey, Chris, thanks. It's good
Yeah.
to,
Oh, go ahead.
it's great to be here with everyone. Thanks for that. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm based here in Seattle on traditional Duwamish and the Coast Salish lands. And it's a real honor to be joining with Shauna and Chairman Grijalva to talk about this really important topic of protecting 30% of our lands, freshwaters, and oceans by 2030. And hope I do it justice following up these 2 great speakers. But as Chris said, I've been doing this for quite a while. It's kind of sad to admit, but 30 years just about I've been doing conservation work. And I honestly feel like we're in a moment now with the enthusiasm around these conservation efforts, and especially conservation efforts done in a new way, and the opportunity we have to build a bigger movement to get more stuff done. I think that is such an opportunity. And I think it was mentioned, we have a president who was willing to, through an executive order, set a national goal of protecting 30% of our lands and waters. And that's something, you know, in his first week in office was very exciting, and that momentum that he sets up. And then, you know, what a great honor and opportunity to have and then, you know, the Department of Interior being Indigenous led with Secretary Holland at the helm. I think that, you know, we're in a great place, and I think the opportunity is there for us to come together and really build this movement out. And I think the path to conserving 30% of our lands and waters must reflect our nation's values and the needs of all communities and people across the country. And I think the previous speakers really kind of hit on that. And I'm going to outline at the Sierra Club, we've been thinking about this and organizing our work around 5 core principles. And some of those have been touched on, but I'll touch on them again because I think it's important to hear. So this, you know, the first is that these conservation efforts must be locally led. So we're out here there to support locally led conservation efforts. The US can only reach this 30 by 30 goal by doing more to help communities protect places that matter to them and to protect them in a way that is meaningful to the folks in those communities. The second is to work toward a more equitable and inclusive vision for nature conservation. And as Shauna said, the costs and impacts of resource extraction and pollution have fallen disproportionately on low-income communities and communities of color across the US. So this 30 by 30 goal must address those disparities moving forward. Third, again, honor the sovereignty of tribal nations and Indigenous communities. This effort needs to reflect meaningful consultation with tribes and indigenous communities, and we must be helping them fulfill their visions and priorities for stewardship of the natural world and their historic resources as well. Fourth, we know that our federal and public lands are important, but just the distribution of land ownership across the country, and that require, we know that we need to be honored and support private land conservation as well as a key principle in this. And lastly, this effort needs to be guided by science. And other speakers have mentioned the kind of two dual threats that we're facing from climate change and the extinction crisis. And science tells us that land conservation is a key component in both of those, whether that's protecting our old growth forests and engaging in reforestation efforts to suck these climate pollution out of the air, or protecting core wildlife habitat and wildlife corridors. So those are the core principles that we are looking at as we engage in this. And then I see some in the questions, and I get this a lot, the question of, can we do it? Is this possible? It seems very ambitious. And the short answer is, yeah, it is definitely possible. The US, we have about 65% of our lands in either largely natural condition, or in an easily restored to natural conditions. And the US is one of the top 5 countries in the world when it comes to this natural quality land. So, with an ambitious agenda and strong leadership, we definitely have the ability to get there. We also know that many of the policies we need for this, they're not new and they're not complicated, and many of them, do exist. The federal, state, and local governments have an extraordinary range of conservation powers, from the executive reach of the president to create national monuments, to the great work by folks like Chairman Grijalva in Congress on legislation to protect our special places, down to the local zoning authorities of city councils. So we have this ability to move forward with conservation. And people, the other question you get a lot is, what are we counting as protected? And right now, science tells us that we're at about 12% of our lands protected, and they're using a kind of a scoring system developed by the US Geological Survey that sets that up. And those protected lands are places that we're familiar with, like national monuments and national parks, some, but not all of our Forest Service lands as well. And I think as we're moving forward, we're going to need to keep all of the tools in the toolbox available for these conservation efforts, and be looking to build out new opportunities and thinking about them as being very locally led. I think that's the key to this. And, we know that local and state governments could be protecting 50% more of the lands than they currently are. And there's opportunities out there with new and expanded open space programs or wildlife corridor designations and the like. So we know that the opportunity is there and that the tools are there. So what's needed and what's new in this is the scale of what we're working to achieve. And that's going to require immense political will and creative and relentless advocacy, and a very energized grassroots movement. And luckily, as folks have said, the polls tell us that the American public is behind us on this. Polling shows that a vast majority of the public is supportive of these new conservation efforts. So we are all working out there to bring and build this movement. And how are we going to do that? We're going to raise awareness about the value as lands as a climate solution and tap into the climate activism. We're going to connect land protection to climate policy. We're going to integrate indigenous knowledge and draw on local relationships to the land. We're going to put the principles of justice and equity front and center and join forces with frontline communities to increase access to nature for more Americans and build new environmental champions. I think those last two are hugely important and key to the success of this effort. By putting equity and justice at the center of our work, we're forming collaborative partnerships with communities who often have the greatest stake in winning. And these partnerships make our movement smarter and more resilient. So at Sierra Club, our organizers are out there making these connections. They're building teams of people interested in protecting our landscapes, all the way from large treasured landscapes to creating more local parks next door, and all of these opportunities in between. I think I'm going to stop there. I feel like I've been talking for a while. I'm going to pass it back to Chris, see where we go from here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. So we are going to now open it up for questions and answers from participants on this forum. We got a number of questions ahead of time that people have submitted before the forum began. So we will go through some of those, and then we'll get to your Q&A questions that folks have submitted in the Zoom here. So the first question that we have is for Chairman Grijalva. Chairman, what legislation has a chance of passing the Senate this year to support public lands, wildlife conservation, and clean air, clean water, and oceans? Can you talk a little bit about what are our prospects in Congress for this year?
I think in the House of Representatives, the prospects are good. They're not, I couldn't talk with the finality it's going to happen, but they're good. And what the two committees, Energy and Commerce and Natural Resources, turn out and put on the floor have a chance and a good chance. I think within our own caucus, I think they're all going to be. There's some bipartisanship, as we saw with the Land and Water Conservation Fund, where we saw with some other land issues that 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 Republicans will vote on those conservation, particularly as it affects near their district or in their states. So we look at that as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the Senate, I think there's going to have to come a reckoning at the Senate around the filibuster and the 60 vote threshold. There has to be a reckoning. I think the reckoning could be, and possibly should be, from my own opinion, is around the voting rights, because I think that is a franchisement issue. It is an issue that cuts across many things. It's about democracy, and it is about the future of our party, if I may be partisan on that issue. And I think that has an opportunity to break that ice, to be an important one in which we can effectively build a coalition to challenge that filibuster. And I think work is underway on that, because you're going to have land packages that you put together, but you're going to have broad, comprehensive pieces of legislation, which is whether it's on mining reform, whether it's on the lands package that the subcommittee that Chairman Nagus now chairs, and the staff there, Brandon et al., are putting together, whether it is on oceans and waters, which is where Mr. Lowenthal is, whether it is around the issues of energy, where Mr. Huffman is, and then where Mr. Lowenthal is on energy and minerals in terms of those. I think there's big comprehensive land packages that can come out of that, energy packages and protection of our waters, because part of the issue is what the natural resource can do in terms of fighting climate change. And at that, I think the contribution there can be huge. And if the 30-30 initiative is the goal, then all those things are open. So there's some broad pieces of legislation that I think need standalone status. But in terms of putting a package of individual pieces of legislation, that's probably at this point, without breaking that 60 vote issue, is probably the most logical path in terms of putting together a lands package or a water oceans package. But I would like to see I think we can include many things in the infrastructure bill, and we can include many things around reconciliation. But I think all those things need to work at the same time, and then reinforcing what Deb is doing in Interior is going to be an important function of our committee as a whole and the subcommittees, and also providing her with the congressional support that she's going to need going forward. I think the Senate's a little harder not to crack, not because the House doesn't pay attention to these things, but because of the past habit. And the past habit is that we really can't do anything because we need 60 votes. And I think that mindset sometimes is more of a detriment to trying to move things than anything else. So once we break that 60 vote imperative, and I think it should be around voting rights, then I think the rest of what we're talking about becomes even much more possible. But that's my assessment of where it's at right now. I'm going to concentrate on the House because that's where we do our work. And if we can get it out of the House and we get leadership to put our stuff on the floor with your help, then I think it adds to momentum and pressure going forward to the Senate. And that's part of it as well.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. The next question we have is, let's see here. What is equity-centered conservation look like in practice? What are the biggest obstacles that we see, and what unlearnings need to happen? And so I will leave that open for whoever wants to answer that question.
Well, I can get us started by saying I think one of the biggest traditional conservation focuses that maybe needs to be rethought is geography. When we focus on protecting acres of wildland, or the big wilderness areas, which we love, which are super important, but if we only do that, then we're missing out on the benefits that can be had in cities and urban areas, in degraded lands that may need restoration and reforestation, and really reaching out to different communities, thinking about who are we serving with conservation? What does it mean to serve a community, and how can their needs be met, and how can they be present as we make these decisions?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and support and echo everything that Shauna said. And I think about this and looking at that question, I don't really think about it as like an unlearning necessarily. I do think that in the conservation movement, we become, we were successful in what we do, and that success has gotten our kind of focus more and more narrow as we've been doing this work. And I think the 30 by 30 initiative is a chance to sort of take a step back and think broad again. And I've always said, if people have asked, like, what would you do if you weren't a conservationist? I've always said I'd go back to be a civics teacher, because I think one thing I've learned doing this conservation work for a long time is the sort of how people's voices and people's votes sort of matter, and people's engagement matters. And, Mr. Grijalva is talking about the Voting Act and breaking the filibuster in the Senate around that. And I think what's happened with our democracy is we've seen, we're very proud of our democracy, but it has not always been a democracy for everybody. And we are needing to make those changes. And we see that when we make those changes and open the democracy up, we get better leadership. And I think that's the same for the conservation movement. We have had this success, but really to have success moving forward, we need to open it up and bring more people in and build this movement moving forward. And so I think that's the key to this effort.
Yeah.
If I may, two things and my co-conspirator in the Environmental Justice for All Act is Representative McEachin, a good man, and his commitment and his staff's commitment to this has been really, really good to the issue and to the piece of legislation. It took us almost 18 months to get that piece of legislation done, because we went to EJ frontline activist organizations, and started developing a piece of legislation at that very necessary level and then moved up. And even when we did the draft legislation, we sent it out and got responses and questions. And one of the good points that was made about how to incentivize private land conservation as part of the entire package is one of the points that came back in terms of the reaction that people had. And two things we learned, that there's a uniqueness to each community, urban, and that many times that there is no cookie cutter of what it should look like. More, there's a process that I think is essential. That's why in the Environmental Justice for All Act, we talk about that transition, we talk about revenue, but we also talk about enforcement. And that we feel that this issue, because of its discriminatory history, needs to be under the Civil Rights Act as a point of redress for communities that feel they're being discriminated in terms of siting and emissions, etc. The second, and discharges. And the second issue is also of importance, and that is the assessment of effect based on a cumulative total, not just an isolated total. That if you're going down Cancer Alley and all those industries are there, that there is a cumulative effect that lasts for most of the company that's coming in at the end. That that accumulation has affected the points that my colleague talked about with the health of people in frontline communities and backyard communities. So I think it's different, but I do believe that issue is a bridge to the bigger issue of conservation, a bridge to protect basic laws like NEPA, Endangered Species, Wilderness Act, etc. That they become the mechanisms that empower these communities, and I think that being that bridge where it brings constituencies together, and I think the issue is access to green space. The issue is to create the protections around conservation, but also create the opportunities within accessible areas, particularly in urban areas and some of the rural communities around this country that badly need it. And in terms of indigenous folk and tribal land, I think more emphasis on protection and conservation, more emphasis on consultation, and more emphasis on the sovereignty question about making decisions that affect their own land. And that is not being followed now. We know that with the pipelines, we know that with other issues. And so I think there's an opportunity there, but I think each one, mountaintop removal, remediation, and restoration is going to be different from the ash piles in Detroit. And I mentioned, or the incinerator in LA. It's different, but it's the same in terms of processes and the protections around that issue.
Yes, Chairman, I want to go back to something that you said earlier about voting rights. And so I think to center equity in conservation, you have to think beyond conservation, because if certain communities aren't able to vote or face insurmountable barriers to voting, then what can we accomplish democratically? And I think that also applies to things like policing. Protected lands are policed lands. And if people of color don't feel safe from the police, if there's no accountability, when our communities of color are able to be murdered by police without accountability, there's no equity in conservation.
I think that the issue, speaking from a limited experience on this committee, or too much experience sometimes, the fact remains that the fights that we've had, as you well know, has been around retaining something we already have. I think the mindset now is retaining, strengthening that, and moving beyond what we already have. And I agree with my friend that said that this requires almost a whole different way to think and approach the question of conservation as it relates to the very critical constituency building that needs to happen around urban America.
Yes, yes, thank you all. So we have probably about a few more questions here. And Dan, I'm going to send this one over to you. Can you reiterate can you just talk a little bit more about what is actually protected lands, and how we get there, and thinking about what additional lands are there available? Is it mostly federal lands? Is it state lands? Is it private lands? What that looks like, and what is Sierra Club's role in identifying what those lands are?
Sure, I can start to have those conversations. So again, our goal, or the goal of this 30 by 30 effort, is to protect 30% of our lands, freshwaters, and oceans by 2030. We are currently, the metrics that people generally use is that we're currently have about 12% of our lands and waters protected. So we need to, increase, like a little more than double the level, the amount of protections we have now. The way that we count the currently protected lands, there's a scoring system that the scientific community generally uses that looks at, the highest level of these protected spaces are lands that are, basically are fully ecologically functioning. And then the sort of bottom of that scale are places that have been lost to industrialization and it's a 5 or 4-part scale. And we've been counting the top 2 parts of that scale as protected. So with kind of lands where the natural systems are fully functioning, and lands where they're predominantly driven by natural function with some engagement from human management is allowed as well. And those are places that are pretty familiar to, to a number of the Sierra Club members and volunteers. Our national parks, our state parks, some wildlife refuges, our national monuments, those are falling into that conservation. I feel very strongly that looking forward, as we move forward in this 30 by 30, those levels of conserved areas are going to be core to the new effort, but we're going to be looking at different types of protections and counting different areas of land as we're listening to the local communities. And I think, again, that's what is key to this whole effort, is we need to get more folks on board and be doing conservation that is responsive to the local community needs. We'll be identifying new ways to secure these, protections and conservation. And so, and I think the second part of that question was, what are we doing to identify those landscapes? And again, we are engaged in it. These efforts are locally, have to be, I think, to be successful, locally driven. And so our organizers and our chapters and our volunteers are engaged in a number of local coalition efforts where we're, working with the people on the ground and the people in the local community to identify the important landscapes, to identify the area, the places that are under threat from industrialization. And then, as Shauna said, the places that are in need of being restored and brought back, to provide these opportunities for access to nature to folks in our, cities and other communities. So I think, I know that's not an answer like that people want, where it's like, we are doing this and it's this land here that's the place that's most important. But I think for this to work, it needs to be coming from the people on the ground and, be that locally led bottom up effort. And so it's, I think it takes folks getting involved in their local community, making these connections, building community and having conversations about what lands and waters are important to people and what protecting them would look like to the folks there on the ground.
Yeah, and we're seeing already a number of fights all across the country of protecting more lands within various communities. Can you talk about some of the work that some of the campaign reps and organizers are doing on the ground in some of the areas that we're currently working in?
Yeah, so I mean, we're seeing it, across the country. Examples like Aviquame National Monument and the effort in Southern Nevada with local communities that have identified places that are culturally important to them and in need of protection. And we're seeing a push for a national monument designation there that's happening in the Eastern Sierra with communities there coming together around Conglomerate Mesa and other places. So it's, there's I think about like talking with our chapters in Arkansas who are looking at a new state park, pushing for a new state park in Arkansas. So these efforts are happening all over the place, and it's exciting and difficult to sort of work to catalog all of those, because there's, I think it's just going to keep growing, and to meet these goals and to meet that demand, it's just going to take more. It'll be more and more of these homegrown efforts that add up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. I totally agree with that. And thanks for sort of jumping in on the local side. There were a number of questions about how Sierra Club members and supporters, groups and chapters can get more engaged in this fight. Shauna, I'd open it up to you for any other suggestions on the local level of how people can get engaged in this work.
Yeah, I'd say do some research, take a look at what's going on in your city or your local government, and think about the conditions that need to take place in your community to effectively protect nature there. So some of those issues might be housing density and affordability. Are people being pushed out into areas that are part of that football field's worth of nature that's being paved over because they can't afford to live in the city, or they're building sprawl rather than densely? Transportation. Does your area need more biking and walking trails, which are a lower impact for both climate change and protecting nature than car infrastructure? Do you have local friends groups that you could get involved with and advocate for the protection of your local parks and to join the momentum on 30 by 30? Yeah, that's where I would start.
Great, thank you. All right, and for the last question and closing thoughts as we wrap up with the last few minutes, I'm going to turn it over to Chairman Grijalva to give the audience and participants an action. What is one thing that they can do after this call in order to move this work forward and in order to see immediate change in this work?
I think one of the most effective things is to have the decision makers at whatever level, and at a federal level, hear directly, know directly, and feel that constituent urgency to do something. I think that's vital and can be very effective. And like I said, many of the local issues, because part of conservation is, the definition is sometimes narrowed, but it's a broad definition. It's about cultural resources. It's about historic resources. It's about sacred sites. It's about a variety of many things that when we talk about conservation that add to that land total are areas that we need to because of what implications and importance they have in those areas. When we talk about Sky Islands in Southern Arizona, that becomes something that has a lot of support from surrounding communities as well. So I think that it's the very localized urgency, and I think Sierra Club and Access are doing a really good job of localizing it, taking that national narrative and bringing it directly to those elected officials with specific examples of what is needed within their communities. I think that's very powerful, and it helps move the whole agenda, because the task ahead of us at 3030 is not going to be a walk in, if you pardon the pun, a walk in the park. there is going to be political resistance, and there is going to be the same foolish narratives that we've heard forever about this is about jobs, turning back the clock, uh, federalizing our lands, taking away private property. All the scare tactics that we've been fighting are going to be front and center in this discussion. And the best way to push back on that is to have that local voice focused in on those elected officials, regardless of what level. And I'm for congressional level, it's imperative. I think you should appreciate that does have an impact, and it has a very strong impact, because it reinforces what people are doing well and good, and it makes people at least, at the very minimum, stop and think about what is being presented in front of them. So appreciate the time. I have to get off, but excellent discussion, and looking forward to whatever work we need to do going forward together. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for all you're doing and being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot.
So either of you all, Dan, any last thoughts? What are some take actions that folks can do right after this call, and how to stay involved with this campaign?
It's hard to follow up on the chairman. I think he nailed it, in my mind, exactly right. It's it goes back to my mind, civics and engagement at that local level. And again, just to reinforce what he said, I think bringing this message and if you're out there and are supportive of seeing this, conservation grow in your area, you need to let your elected officials know, whether that's your mayor or your county council folks or your city councils. They all have an incredible amount of power, and we need to be delivering it there. And that desire is going to lift itself up through the system and create the conservation that we need.
Great. Shauna?
Yes, I would echo that and say always advocacy on the local level, as Dan mentioned, but also national. And I know it's so easy to feel powerless these days in such a hyper partisan atmosphere in Congress, but some of the biggest conservation bills that were passed within the last couple of years were bipartisan. And so if you let your congressperson know your feelings about a certain bill, or just in general about your community's goals, they might just listen to you. So that's the one way that one person can really have an outsized impact.
Great. Thank you all so much. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to be with us for this forum. I hope you all had a great time, learned a lot, got a lot of good insight. There were a lot of questions that we didn't get to, so our apologies. We only have an hour for this, but please stay in touch, get involved, and don't forget to get outside. And we will be here again for another Sierra Forum soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.